But I do think it's important that you are aware of when it's beneficial and when it probably isn't, because it can also impact like the whole business and recruitment outcomes on the long term.
My name is Katharina, and I'm the Community and Event Manager at Equalture, a company that is on a mission to shape the world of unbiased hiring. Welcome to the Oops, I'm Biased podcast. On today's episode of the Oops, I'm Biased podcast, I am speaking to my dear colleague Denise. We are covering intuition bias today. This might be, as I've called it in the episode as well, sort of an umbrella bias to cover multiple, just because it connects very closely to many biases that we might have already covered and some that we're yet to cover on this series. I really hope that you enjoy this episode. It is packed with examples and best practices on how to minimize the impact of intuition bias. And it's just a really fun episode. I hope you enjoy this one. Without further ado, here is intuition bias. All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to people who've heard a few episodes of our mini bias deep dives on this podcast before. If you're a new listener, very warm welcome. I also want to welcome my guest host of today. It is my dear colleague, Denise. We are covering intuition bias together, which I think is going to be quite an interesting conversation to have. We might already have some sort of idea of what we might be talking about, but I think Denise has a lot of best practices, a lot of examples that might illustrate that bias quite well. Before we jump into the bias itself, I would love for you to introduce yourself, Denise. It's so great to have you today.
Thank you. Well, I'm Denise. I work as a digital marketer at Equalture. I've been doing it for 1.5 years now. And super excited to be here.
You are a direct colleague of mine, which I think makes this episode much more fun even, because we work a lot on a day-to-day together on different things. We obviously have a bias glossary on our website. We work a lot with discrimination in recruitment, trying to offer equal opportunities through our solutions. So I think intuition bias might be one of those very foundational biases that we come across in our work. Would you give us a bit of a definition of what that is?
Yeah, sure. Yes, indeed. Intuition bias, the name already says it. It's basically the tendency to make subjective judgments based on your intuition, your personal experience, gut feeling, or your instincts, rather than using objective methods to make decisions.
Yeah, you already mentioned gut feeling there. I think we sometimes are a bit prone to use instincts, intuition, gut feeling sort of interchangeably. Could you give us a bit of a sort of a explanation or maybe show us a bit where the difference between gut feeling and intuition might lie?
Yes, of course. Gut feeling is sometimes useful. It can be beneficial, for example, in dangerous situations or risky situations, and actually alert you to pay more attention to a certain situation. So in that case, it's really useful. But this gut feeling can also be influenced by several biases, which then can also lead to more biased decision making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it is sort of a part of intuition, sort of that immediate response that you might have in a situation of danger, as you explained. Well, we hope that you're not in danger in your day-to-day life a lot, and you might also not be in danger, hopefully, in your recruitment process. Could you give us maybe an example of what intuition bias looks like in the wild, as it were, in your day-to-day life?
Well, I do think intuition bias can have a lot of examples, especially in your personal life. Can be financial decisions, social interactions, small decisions like picking a restaurant, shopping decisions, like almost everything. How it then would look like is, for example, you would make a financial decision to invest in a certain company just because you feel like this is a good company. Like no factual evidence. You just have a good feeling with it. Or you would buy, for example, a certain brand of food just because the packaging looked nice, or you have a certain feeling with certain brands. That's basically how it looks like in your personal life. And yeah, indeed, this can be everything. Like all decisions you make, small decisions you make. It's basically how you make them.
Yeah. And it's got a lot to do, I think, with past experiences, right? If you've had a good experience with something, that doesn't need to be based in any sort of reality, but that sort of informs our intuition of saying, well, I've had a similar situation in the past. I've maybe bought from this brand before, or maybe I know someone who's bought from this brand and they had a good experience. So that sort of informs our intuition in that way. It probably has a lot to do with personal, sort of interpersonal and personal connections as well. Do you have maybe an example that you could think of now, sort of on the fly, where this comes into play when we are sort of speaking to other people?
I think when speaking to other people, it's very easy to let this bias come into play. Also, if you meet new people, and you have like a positive first interaction, you immediately have a positive feeling about certain people. While when a conversation is difficult, or you might not, or might have certain assumptions about someone's maybe not as confident impression, or they don't give you of like the nice positive feeling, that can definitely lead to making assumptions about someone, and also maybe the wrong assumptions about someone. Based on your intuition.
Yeah. Sounds like quite a subtle bias, quite one that might be quite hard to pinpoint. I think the conversation around if you meet people for the first time leads us quite nicely into recruitment context, where recruiters meet people all the time to figure out if they are a good fit for a role. Where do you see intuition bias come into play in recruitment?
In recruitment, as you already said, in recruitment, it's all about meeting new people, also selecting people based on your decisions. So here the intuition bias can play an important role into the hiring decisions that recruiters or hiring managers make.
Yeah. What could that look like? Do you have an example of I don't know, a very tangible situation where intuition bias makes you make a wrong decision potentially?
In recruitment, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, for example, if you have 4 candidates, and with one candidate, you had a super nice conversation, you had similar interest, conversation went really well, you probably will have a positive feeling about this candidate and will unconsciously favor this candidate above the other candidates, while other candidates might be more qualified to do the job. So this can lead to making the wrong decision in hiring processes.
Yeah, I can almost hear them then say sort of, oh, I just have a really good feeling about that candidate, or sort of, oh, something tells me they might be a really good fit. That something is your intuition that tells you we have a lot in common. I could get on with you, and I could probably go for a beer after work with you, but that doesn't tell you very much other than that you might be personally a good fit and they might be a good friend to you. Another thing that I thought about is obviously this is very much to do with personal interactions, as you said, so meeting someone or advancing someone in the interview stages if you have a short list of candidates. Is there any other place in the recruitment process where intuition bias can really impact hiring decisions other than those personal touch points?
I think, as I already said, like I'm not the expert on recruitment, of course, but if you look at the whole hiring process, it's often made with more decisions, and it's not only in personal interactions that can trigger this bias, but it's also like strategic decisions that can be influenced. If you have any past experiences with certain processes or certain methods that you use, you would probably favor these methods or assume these are the right ones to continue with. And this can be through the whole whole process.
Yeah. I think this also shows quite well how interconnected intuition bias might be then to a mere exposure effect, which we've covered quite recently with one of our colleagues, Tommy, where he says, well, mere exposure effect is all about if you're familiar with something, you're going to favor that, which is then linking to that sort of, or reinforced by the intuition bias of thinking, well, it must be right because I have a good feeling about this. That might just come from those two biases working together, or a similarity bias where if someone's quite similar to you or you've had a similar experience, then that can sort of strengthen that intuition. Yeah.
And definitely. I also think it's never like one bias on itself. It's always a combination, which makes it also difficult to pinpoint. Like, oh, this is this bias at place. But yeah, definitely true.
In that way, intuition bias might just be one of those umbrella biases that cover quite a lot or influence quite a lot of other biases. So I would encourage anyone who's listening to go back to older bias episodes and see how they might connect to this one. I think that could be quite an interesting research to see how they all sort of fit into the bigger puzzle of biases. I think what you just mentioned is also quite interesting to say. It's quite difficult to pinpoint. That might also make it quite difficult to minimize the impact. If you don't really know sort of where it lies or where it comes from, it might be quite difficult to minimize the impact. Do you have some best practices or tips to share on how to minimize the impact of intuition bias?
You mean in the recruitment process, right?
Yes.
I think there are a few best practices that you can use. I think first of all, it all starts with awareness around different biases. So make sure everyone is aware, but also follows trainings, because awareness is the first step to actually overcome certain biases. And I think a second best practice, like a lot of biases show in the interview stage. So having a structured interview process, like having a pre-set of questions that allow objective decision making, to make sure that all candidates are assessed on the same thing. And here also, I think a diverse interview panel would be very beneficial. Like if you have 4 people assessing or interviewing with a candidate, and only one person favors a certain candidate, and the other 3 scored like way much worse, then there's probably some bias at play. So then you also minimize the risk of making the decision based on one recruiter's opinion for feelings or instinct.
Yeah, I think that's those are some really great pieces of advice. It's something that we probably mention quite a lot in different episodes, because structured interviews, diverse interview panels, and also this awareness piece, the education piece, are just so foundational for all of the biases. The more aware we become, the more we can check each other for these biases, and the more we stick to a standardized process, the less it can have an impact on our hiring decisions, which is sort of ultimately where we see things go wrong. I think something that I would also still add to, and we've probably also mentioned way too many times, people will probably be sick of that, is focus your initial touch points on gathering a lot of data right away. That can be through those structured questions in a phone screening, figuring out, okay, where do you fall? What qualifications do you have? What behaviors and skills do you show? That can be through an assessment as well, in saying, okay, can we test you right away? That's why also assignments and case studies are really good to see, okay, can you actually show what you're telling us that you're good at? I think those different sources of data points and information points are quite critical in making sure that you don't just base it on your gut feeling or your intuition in that way. Was there anything else from your side, Denise, that you would like to pass on to our fellow recruiters listening today?
Let me think. Well, I think everyone has some sort of intuition bias. If I look at myself, I'm also a very intuitive person. So all decisions I make outside of my work life are probably very intuitive, but I do think it's important that you are aware of when it's beneficial and when it probably isn't, because it can also impact like the whole business and recruitment outcomes on the long term.
Yeah. Denise, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I had a blast exploring intuition bias with you today. Maybe you'll come join us again for a future episode. I think our listeners also took away quite a lot. Thank you for providing those practical examples and most importantly, those tips at the end. I think the more we can become aware of intuition biases, the better it will get. And I hope that this episode also plays some sort of role in your journey as you're listening. Thank you so much for joining us today, Denise. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. Also, thank you for having me. And maybe in the future we'll be here again.
Yeah, would be fun to do it again. To everyone who listened today, thank you so much for tuning in again. Please be sure to check us out in 2 weeks' time. We are bi-weekly podcasts, so we're coming back with another bias in 2 weeks. We don't cover all of them, of course. We haven't covered them by far. There's 177 biases. So please reach out to us and tell us what bias we should cover next, which ones you're most interested in. And with that, wishing you a wonderful 2 weeks and hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.